Lynette Reed, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Hey, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's wonderful to have you. Thanks so much for taking time out of your schedule and being willing to come and share your expertise and experience with us.
Well, I'm looking forward to visiting with you today. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. As we get started, I want to start just by sharing Lynette's bio with the listeners. Dr. Reed is a people and culture partner. Her mission is to help people and organizations feel more connected to the world around them and the relationships that are most important to them. Dr. Reed has mentored people from various organizations to include businesses, not-for-profit organizations, schools, allied health agencies, chambers of commerce, government entities, and churches. She has taught courses on world religion and world cultures and continuing education courses approved by the American Planning Association for Ethics, HCI, and team building leadership training sessions approved by the Texas Education Agency for continuing education of teachers, superintendents, and school board members. Her current literary contributions include an executive summary paperback titled Fixing the Problem, Making Changes in How You Deal with Challenges, as well as book contributions, syndicated articles, guest radio appearances, and a series of children's books with Abingdon Press. She is also a co-founder and board member of the Institute for Soul-Centered Leadership at Seton Cove. Her academic background includes a Doctor of Ministry in Spirituality, Sustainability, and Interreligious Dialogue, and a Master of Science in Communication Sciences and Disorders. What an interesting and fascinating background that you have, and again, welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, it's kind of all over the place, but it's something I've always enjoyed doing. So that if they say if you do what you love, you're never working a day in your life. So I think that definitely works for me.
Awesome. And I think some of the best backgrounds are the all over the place backgrounds.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'm just biased because that's kind of my background as well.
Exactly. And actually, the way we met was through some of the book contributions. So,
exactly. We've known each other now for many years, and you've contributed chapters to a couple different books, book projects, and it's been great. And we got reconnected, and I thought, with your background, I love the idea of mindfulness, and as it connects to your background in how to help organizations with corporate culture, but as well with your spirituality, sustainability, interreligious dialogue. That's a really interesting and fascinating cross section, and I think it'll lend itself well to a really interesting discussion today. So before we get started, is there anything else you would like to add in terms of your own background or anything you'd like the listeners to know about you?
Well, that's all the kind of professional stuff. On the side, the two things that are kind of lesser known are that I do like amateur photography. So if you go to like my webpage or my Instagram page, I tend to lean towards putting pictures on there with little discussions, and so all the pictures are mine that I've done when I've traveled. And then also I do write music. I've actually written some children's music for some organizations, but then I've also done some adult stuff too. But I don't make a living at those. I just do those more for hobbies. So that's kind of my other stuff.
Excellent. And I'm not sure I can claim to be a musician, but I enjoy music a lot. I sing in community choirs, that sort of thing, and I find a lot of fulfillment and joy through that. So I definitely understand, the creative side and giving ourselves opportunities to tap in to those that other part of our brain and other talents that we may have. So great.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, as we get started today, I thought maybe we could start with your approach generally as you go into organizations as a coach or a consultant. If you can just describe how you start that process, how you have those initial discussions, and describe that for the listeners a little bit, and then I think we can move into more about conflict resolution and how that connects with your spirituality and sustainability, interreligious dialogue background, and then kind of go from there. How does that sound?
Yeah, sure. Well, a lot of times when I work with individuals or organizations, the first thing I really kind of do is get a feel for what's going on. You know, normally when they're calling me, it's because they're wanting to strengthen their corporate culture or they're wanting, there's a conflict. And so I have to find out a little bit of what's going on. So I'll kind of get a feel for the culture and what's happening, because I think you have to have a little bit of background information to kind of know where you're going to move forward. And then once I do that, then the real thing I'm trying to do is find ways to make people more connected, more connectivity. And so that kind of plays in, although I don't really talk about this when I'm working with businesses, but since we're talking about that whole spirituality aspect, what I'll a lot of times do is look at how they're connected both to all to themselves, to other people, and to the world. And so when I'm looking at that organization, I'm saying, okay, if we want to become better connected, then we have to see what we're strengthening in our organization and what we're fracturing in our organization, with these connections between a person individually and how they see themselves, between a person and how they interact with other people, and then also how they interact with the world. So that would go into the sustainability part with, you know, what does the room feel like? How do they approach how people sit together, you know, what is the furniture, you know, those types of things are going to add to the connectivity, either strengthening or fracturing it. So those are the kind of the things that we're first looking at to see, you know, what do we need to build, what do we need to look into as far as the things that are fracturing the company. So that's kind of the starting point.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, you know, you point out the importance of interconnectivity of relationships, and there's so much research out there that demonstrates the value of strong workplace relationships, clear connections to higher levels of employee engagement and satisfaction, lower levels of stress and anxiety, lower levels of withdrawal cognitions. You know, there's basically a lot of really great outcomes when you get people together and they have stronger relationships. They collaborate more, which leads to greater creativity and innovation and productivity. And so we want good relationships, but we also know the research shows that the number one reason why people leave their jobs is because of workplace relationships, either relationship with coworkers or with a bad boss. And so while it's very clear that it's important, and I think organizations do put effort towards it, it's such a hugely common problem, and a lot of people just aren't equipped with how to heal relationships, how to develop stronger relationships, and how to have balanced, equitable workplace relationships, you know, without crossing a line, but also allowing for a level of sincerity and being genuine, and those elements that require vulnerability. You know, there's this interesting balance that has to happen, and that's probably why it's so difficult to get right in the workplace.
Yeah, well, and the other challenge, I think, too, I agree with that, is that every company and every person's different. So what might work for one company isn't necessarily going to work for another company, as far as things like, okay, what do you want your culture to look like? Some people may want a very different culture for their organization than others. Some people might have things that are more important to them than others. And so I think all of those factors kind of play into, when you're trying to build something, you want to try to build something that's very authentic, as opposed to what you think everybody wants to hear. You know, that mentality of do we want to build something that's authentic to who we really want to be, or do we want to just kind of say, okay, yeah, this is what we are, but we're not going to do anything to support that. And I think that's the biggest challenge I see with organizations. And the bigger the organization gets, the harder it is, because you've got more personalities and you've got more structures that are in place that you have to kind of organize around or look at. So, and the thing for me though is, and I love talking about that whole discussion on how do you build it in, because one of the statistics I've seen, I wish I could remember where it's from, and I'll have to look it up for you, but a long time ago there was a statistic that was saying that 30% of the 70% of the population of businesses believe that those types of things are important, like engagement, culture, and all that, and only about 30% of them actually do it. And so you've got this huge diversion between people recognizing that something's important, but then trying to say, okay, how do we integrate that in? And I think that's the thing that I found with the book that I wrote, Fixing the Problem, was when I was working on my dissertation years ago. There are actually spiritual elements, but I don't really call them spiritual, because a lot of times people think in terms of religion, or crystals is the other big one I get, which, you know, can have their value in some places, but when you're talking about a business situation, how do you integrate that connectivity of spirit, which is how do you connect to yourself, to other people, and the world? And so you build stuff on that in a way that's going to make it either strengthen or fracture. And so the elements that I found that I actually work with businesses are spiritual components, but they're also human potential. So whatever word you want to use to define it, it's really talking about how do we as humanity find ways to either strengthen or fracture ourselves in the way that we connect. And I actually found in my research 3 things that seem to, over the past however many years I've been doing this, to work pretty standardly for all people. And so that's kind of the things that I teach whenever I'm working with somebody, is these 3 elements in the model and how to use them in their personal lives and in their workplace. And so that's kind of what I'm addressing when I'm teaching those 3 items.
Excellent. And a lot of great concepts that you just shared there. And I want to go back just for a minute to talk about strengthening that organizational culture. And you pointed out that there, you know, you're not creating a culture in a vacuum usually, unless it's a new startup where it's completely fresh and you're starting from scratch. There is a history involved. You have personalities involved. You have existing policies, practices, and procedures. You have existing mechanisms and structures, all of which sustain the status quo. That's kind of the whole point of organization, is maintaining the organization perpetually and sustaining the status quo. And so if we recognize there's a gap, like we see that employee engagement is down, and satisfaction or productivity is down, we know it's important. We're one of those 70%. We know it's important, but nothing we seem to be doing is helping. Then what we have to do is recognize we can't just imagine and create a vision for a new culture and just have it happen because we say so. It has to be a very intentional, sustained process over a long period of time, where you address all of those structures, all those mechanisms, all those procedures, policies, practices. Everything has to be addressed if you want to move into this new culture. Otherwise, the organization, regardless of the time and money you spend, if you don't sustain it, the organization will revert back to the way the structure is set up. It's just the way that organizations are. And so when I see companies fail with their engagement efforts or their culture efforts, it almost always is because of that, because they have good intentions, but it doesn't have the staying power of really going through the hard grind, the hard work of just making sure you're addressing all those different components. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, that 2 things that popped into my mind when you were talking about that is anytime you're learning a new way to do something or creating a new culture, it's kind of like anything that you're learning as a skill. It's a muscle memory thing. You can say, okay, we want to be a friendly company. Well, that's easy to say, but then, okay, how does that look whenever you're doing it? You know, how do you practice making sure that everybody in your company is moving in that direction? And I tend to break things down into kind of 2 areas. One is the business part of it, which is the business plan, and you know, how do you have everything process driven? What does that physical part of your business look like? That could even include, if you're interested in things like that, how's the office set up? You know, what are you trying to portray? If you look at pictures of like companies like Google or new startups, they might look very different than Bank of America or one of those other more institutional as far as what their offices look like. And the other part of it, though, is a second layer, which I call kind of the foundational layer. And that to me is the part probably work the most in is the connectivity part, which is the two examples I like to give are if you look at a tree, the trunk and the branches and the leaves are all the business part. Those are the things you can see and touch and work on day to day in your life. But the thing that really holds it all together are the roots. And so your people and how they behave and how they connect with each other becomes the roots of your company. And so when you're trying to build a company, you have to not only look at the process, the trunk, at the leaves and all that, but you also have to look at the roots and what you're doing to strengthen those. The other example I give is for those of you that are builders out there is if you look at how they build a house. When they build the foundation, they don't just pour concrete, they stick rebar in it to strengthen it. And so to me, when you're looking at how do you strengthen your company, well, you could just slap some concrete down and there you go, move forward. Or you can say, okay, I really want to reinforce this, so I'm going to put some things in place there to help give it a little strength and make it so that as we move forward and do the things that are the business of the day, that we've got this underlying layer of behaviors and attitudes that keep us strong together and unite us in the way that we do our business. So those are kind of it. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. And you just unearthed some hidden memories. In a previous life, I did construction, and I worked in foundations, and so I spent many hours in hot summer days cutting and bending rebar and putting it into concrete and all of that, hauling forms around. Yeah, I think absolutely we need that reinforcement if we want a healthy, sustainable organization. And there's just no shortcuts. There's no easy way around it. It has to be deliberate. It has to be intentional. Let's shift a little bit and talk about mindfulness for a few minutes. How do you define mindfulness, and how does that connect back to what organizational leaders need to do to help their organizations and their people thrive?
Yeah, well, mindfulness, to me, that's a tricky word because it really, to me, can mean so much to different people. Everybody has a different way that they connect with themselves. So I would say that mindfulness is a little bit of that time that you spend figuring out who you are as a person and who your core elements are, so that you can take that out into the world, whether it be with other people or how you're going to treat the environment, any of those elements. And so when you're looking at mindfulness, you're looking at an intentional way to say, okay, this is who I am as a person, and this is how I'm going to take this out. And you can have certain things that help you practice that mindfulness, like, taking breaths, doing yoga. Some people tell me golf is a really good way for them to kind of get into that mindfulness. Anything that gives you that opportunity to just kind of connect and say, hey, I'm going to take a break. In fact, with people who have very high stress jobs where they're just, going 90 to nothing, what a lot of times I'll say for the word of mindfulness is just take, a minute. Do something different, something you enjoy doing that's just going to take you away from all the stresses for just, 60 seconds, set a timer and just take a break. And that works for some people. Some people need to have a longer period of time where they might journal. Some people may find that doing exercise, going for a run is a good time for them. So I think the big challenge is finding something that works for yourself personally, but then if you're a company who's trying to bring mindfulness in, then you have to kind of say, okay, I've got all these different people with all these different ways, so there's not going to be a one size fits all. So it might be you say, okay, let's give everybody a 10-minute break during the day where everybody does whatever works for them for mindfulness, or you just have to kind of play around and find what works for your organization. The other thing I think about
can I jump in for just a second?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think being deliberate about having those conversations with your employees is important, not because you're trying to be prescriptive and say this is how you will do mindfulness, but having the discussion and the conversation about why it's important, helping people think creatively about different ways they can explore their own mechanisms for mindfulness. Two big ones that you didn't mention that a lot of people usually think of first is like meditation and prayer.
Yeah, exactly.
And that works for some people. People who don't, aren't religious or don't feel that spiritual connection in that way, maybe those things don't work, but hiking or taking the dogs for a walk, or other physical exercise. Some work, like I worked in South Korea for a time, and they would have ping pong tables all over the place. And so I worked for LG
Yeah, yeah, there you go.
Electronics.
That's good.
Yeah, they love table tennis in Korea, and people would take 15-minute ping pong breaks, and it essentially was the same thing, right? They also had it was kind of cool in so this was like the LG Electronics campus, which kind of the equivalent in the US, it might be like a Google campus or something.
Right, right.
And they had like on-site meditation rooms. They had like an on-site Buddhist temple that you could go
Oh
to.
my gosh.
So anyways,
Work to the audience. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so the point is, like you said, there's not a one size fits all. There's lots of different ways that it can manifest for people. But it's all about quieting your mind, taking a step back, having a chance to reconnect to self and to others, and to focus, and and
Yeah.
and helping employees recognize and understand why that's important, and then showing the example from top leadership down that this is a priority. Like, we really want you to do this. That means that the CEO, C-suite managers, they have to do it too. Because if they're
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
if they say it's important, but then they don't do it, and the lower level employees don't see them doing it, then they won't do it either,
Right.
because they'll be nervous. So, that just opening up that opportunity to have that discussion is really valuable.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with that. I know some companies I work with, they actually have prayer groups because they are a more prayer centric or Christian centric business. But then there's other companies I work with where foosball is the big thing. They have a big foosball game right in the middle, and whenever you just need a break from work, you go, play foosball or pool or something like that. So I've heard of a lot of really good different ones. There's some that do a happy hour at 4. So at 4 o'clock they have the bars open. So and it works, for that company. So I think that's the thing is kind of being open to there are different options. And you actually said something there that fits right into one of the biggest things that I'm looking at is you're talking about words and actions matching. That's actually part of the model that I was talking about. Is one of the things that I found is that any company, any person, pretty much if you're talking about authenticity and building trust, that people whose words and actions match and they have a very set core of what their behavior is. So like if their core word is friendly or helpful or whatever they've chosen, and their actions match that, and then their actions match what they commit to do, that's a person who's going to be considered authentic. And then if you're and you're going to build a lot of trust with that. If you think about people you've known, the ones who don't respond, they say, yeah, I'm going to do this, but then they don't. Or they say, yeah, I'm a friendly person, but then they yell at people. Those people tend not to be as the people you trust or find authentic. And that could be the same with companies too. So when I'm teaching people, that's one of actually the things that I work with them on, is making sure that they have a very firm definition of what behavior they want, and making sure that their words and actions match it. So that I think is a very, very critical part of any mindful organization, because if you're also talking about mindfulness, you're talking about how you intentionally are planning to connect with people. And
Yeah.
if you don't connect authentically with people, then you're not really considering mindfully how that's going to fracture or strengthen that thread of connection.
Yeah,
So
that's right. Um, we have a few more minutes as we wrap up the discussion today. Maybe you can take a little bit more time to describe your approach to mindfulness and spirituality, interreligious dialogue, how that connects with conflict resolution within organizations.
Well, for me, I have to kind of flip it a little bit, because the way that I look at it is, when we're talking about spirituality, in my picture, when I was doing my research on spirituality, what I found was it basically means breath. Spirit is breath. And so my way of looking at it is, basically with every breath you take, you get to choose what you're going to do and who you're going to be as a person. And if you think about the number of breaths you take in a day, that's quite a few. So you're having to say, okay, if I'm going to have each of these breaths, I get to decide what I'm going to do with it. It's going to be my choices on religion, my choices on how I treat people, my choices on how I'm going to build my company, all of these things. And the more intentionally you do that, and the more that you do it with the intention of words and actions matching, having your keywords, and that can be for a company or yourself. Are you going to be friendly, helpful, and even grumpy? I have found, I tell people, if they give me, negative words like violent or cruel, then, as long as their words and actions matching, at least they're authentic and you know how to deal with them. But you would hope for a company to build and be stronger, or a person to build and be stronger, it would have to be words that are strengthening, friendly, helpful, caring, kind, those types of things. And so if you're building the company to strengthen it, it's going to be words like that, or a person, that's going to be words like that. And make sure those words and actions match. And then don't judge other people as good or bad or wrong or right. You just let them be different. And that's the model that you use, that has to talk about mindfulness, spirituality, corporate culture, engagement, all of those things fit in there, even diversity. We have this big issue right now with diversity. Well, imagine if all you're really focused on is whether you're a friendly or helpful or kind person who is making their words and actions match, and not judging other people as good or bad or wrong or right. What does that business look like, as opposed to one where we're thinking, okay, we got to, be thinking about all these other things, and how we feel about people and how we judge them. We don't really have to put our energy into those things. If we're kind to everybody, that pretty much changes the way you do your whole business. Or if you're friendly to people, then you can build whatever you want on top of that, as far as religion, business plan, all of those things.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Awesome. Well, I love your take, and I think when we focus ourselves and our intentions on these connections and how we relate to other people, that forces us to listen more. That forces us to have deeper connection through empathy and compassion, and those elements naturally help to either resolve conflict or to prevent unhealthy conflict in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so I really like that.
Yeah.
Well, Lynette, it has been awesome talking to you today. Unfortunately, time is drawing to a close. I hope that we can have an opportunity to have further discussion in the future. But before we finish today, would you mind taking just a few minutes and letting the listeners know how they can connect with you and learn more about what you do in your business?
Sure. Yeah. The best way to connect with me is my website. It's www.expectationstoreality.com, and that's the number two. It's expectations with an S, number two, reality.com. And then also a way is LinkedIn. If you go to my LinkedIn page, there's actually different ways you can connect with me via there, and it'll actually take you to my website if you go to my LinkedIn page. So that's another way you can get there.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for your time. It's been a pleasure talking with you today about mindfulness, spirituality, conflict resolution, positive corporate culture, and all these related topics. I hope you are healthy and safe, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.
Yeah, thanks. I've enjoyed visiting with you, and hopefully we'll get to see each other again soon. And I live in Texas. I'm close to Austin, and so everything here is pretty much going like everywhere else. I think we're kind of 50% right now, so everybody's out and about. But I think a lot of people are still taking precautions, and also hopefully everything's good there in Utah also.
Yep. Well, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Hey, you too. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.